If there was ever an anime that we would classify as a slasher as opposed to any of the other genres that populate the medium, it would be Koto Hirano's Hellsing Ultimate. Gore and violence is not uncommon in anime, especially when you look at the cyberpunk stuff that was coming out in the 80s and 90s, but Hellsing takes everything to the extreme. From the very first scene of the series, you know that things are going to be brutal and insane for the rest of the show, and Hellsing Ultimate, for better or worse, delivers on those expectations. And it's not just the bad guys either. Even the good guys of Hellsing Ultimate will leave you questioning your support for them from an objective lens, and to say that the reasons are disturbing is underselling the reality by quite a large margin. So, without further ado, let's jump into the top 10 most disturbing and insanely brutal Hellsing Ultimate characters. Number 1. Cheddar Priest. If the very first villain of your series threatens to violate a young police girl and turn her into his vampiric underling, then you know it isn't exactly going to be a lighthearted watch, and sadly for Seras Victoria, that's exactly what ends up happening. The Cheddar Priest, named after the English city in which he was active, is the first minor antagonist we see in Hellsing Ultimate, and it immediately establishes the baseline for violence in the series. He's introduced feasting on his latest victim as he is interrupted by Seras' special investigations unit. Because the regular side of Britain's policing agencies know nothing about supernatural threats to their country like vampires and ghouls, the palpable fear and tension that Seras feels when the Cheddar Priest takes out her fellow policemen with no effort is practically projected upon us. Compound that with the fact that this man of faith threatens to commit a violent sexual blasphemy against a woman whom he considers to be a non-virgin, and you start to see our reasons for calling Hellsing Ultimate the prototypical supernatural slasher anime. Thankfully, he never gets around to actually making good on his threats and is dealt with by the OG vampire himself, but the Cheddar Priest sets the tone for the rest of the series. In the span of a few minutes, he establishes that the threat levels of this world are set at extreme by default, and that most characters in it will kill first and ask questions later. And that is only if they even feel like interrogating you in the first place. The other option is becoming their literal playthings, and as appealing as we make that sound here, it really isn't. Just look at Cheddar Pea's ghouls. Disgusting. Number 2. Father Alexander Anderson. Did you guys ever think that a word as innocuous as Amen could be a catchphrase that both excites and terrifies the living crap out of you? We didn't either until we met the definition of a mad priest in Father Alexander Anderson. On the surface, his role is the same as Alucard in Hellsing's, eliminating supernatural threats like vampires and ghouls. But from the moment you first meet Anderson, not counting the scene at his orphanage because he's real gentle with his children, you know that this guy has to have a few screws loose for squaring up to Alucard the way he did. Anderson is the quintessential example of what Hellsing's idea of extreme is. He's fanatically devoted to his faith to the point he hates all non-Catholics, even Christians who adhere to other schools of Christianity. He was ready to start a holy civil war in an art gallery just because he was itching for a fight. That's just how unhinged Anderson can be. But what really makes God's Assassin so disturbing is his brutal fighting style, and the fact that, in the end, he had to become a monster to defeat a monster. Watching Anderson fight whilst casually reciting scripture verses from memory is a crowd popper for sure, but it can get borderline uncomfortable for the uninitiated, and that's before he hits himself with Hell in his nail. From his debut in the first episode until his death towards the penultimate episode of Hellsing Ultimate, Anderson had gone on a bit of a redemption arc for his uncontrollable bloodlust, but all that progress was sent down the drain when he decided to forego his humanity and become an eldritch abomination in God's name to try and take down what he considered to be an affront to the natural order. His intense rivalry with Alucard is what makes Alexander Anderson iconic, but it's his conviction in God's absoluteness that makes him such a disturbing character. But Anderson is also an example of an overall good guy that does a few horrifying things, but ultimately has some redeeming qualities to him that don't make him a complete dirtbag in the eyes of the audience. We can't say the same thing about this next guy. Number 3. Jean Valentine. If there's one character that'll put you off watching Hellsing and dismissing it as a gore-filled cuss fest, then it's this guy. Jean Valentine is a character that gets on your nerves and stays there, threatening to violate you in every possible way you can imagine, and then going home to whack one out while thinking about it. No kidding, he actually says something very similar to this in the series. Jean Valentine is your typical over-the-top side villain who throws every worldly insult and depravity in your face with his brash vocabulary vocabulary and murderous swagger. When he attacked Hellsing Manor in episode 2, the series was barely a fifth of the way finished, but Jean's nastiness made you believe everything would end then and there. He ordered his men to slaughter every Hellsing footpad they could find, feed on them, turn them into ghouls, and then use them against Integra herself, whom he threatened to violate and do worse things to while all this was happening through the Manor's speaker systems. In the manga, he also wanted to give Integra's skull the comic book Homelander treatment, and trust us when we say you're better off not knowing what that means. But if you do decide to look it up, don't tell us we didn't warn you first. Jean reduced Hellsing's strength from presumably scores of operatives to just 3, Walter, Seras, and Alucard. Sure, those 3 are strong enough to take out entire nations by themselves, and Jean learns about Walter's skills personally, but the psychological trauma that Integra was forced to deal with upon seeing her fallen soldiers turned into undead ghouls would have made you hate Jean Valentine as much as we do. He would have been a badass if he wasn't such a crass prick about things, because walking straight into lethal gunfire and flipping your enemy off before spontaneously combusting is undeniably cool. But Jean had established himself as such an id-driven brute by then, it just felt satisfying for us watching at home. But while Jean Valentine was all about brawn and brawling, the next entry on our list relies more on his mental faculties, though they are just as twisted as Jean's, if not more. Number 4. Enrico Maxwell. Haters gonna hate and crusaders gonna crusade. This seems to have been the driving philosophy behind the character of Enrico Maxwell, because even when he was faced with a literal army of undead vampire Nazis, he chose to carry out a pointless holy war instead of actually pulling through on his mission. Enrico Maxwell has the same vibe as Furuta from Tokyo Ghoul RE, in that he can snap at any moment, and it almost always leads to a deliciously villainous monologue that just makes you hate him more than you already did a couple seconds ago. Maxwell tries to portray himself as this calm, level-headed clergyman on a mission from the Pope, and thereby God himself. But deep down, he is a spineless coward, and that isn't us saying it, that's his mentor, Alexander Anderson's assessment of him towards the end of his life. Because for a large portion of his life, Maxwell dedicated himself to rising through the ranks by any means necessary to get a position of power that he felt he deserved. And then, as soon as he was made an archbishop and given charge over the Ninth Crusade, he lost himself in the sauce and became a cartoonish tyrant hell-bent on forcefully converting all of England back to Catholicism. Armies of vampires and Alucard be damned. What really cemented his status as an egotistical supervillain was the fact that Maxwell had himself suspended in a transparent box and proceeded to deliver sermons as his crusader army killed everything in their path, living and undead alike. It was sweet satisfaction to see him piss himself when he realized that Alucard had arrived on the battlefield, and even better to know that Anderson himself facilitated Maxwell's death, because you have to be a special kind of evil to make even a mad priest like him seem like a gentle village pastor, and yet that's exactly what Enrico Maxwell ended up doing. Number 5. Zorin Blitz. Imagine if you had to relive your worst nightmares and memories on the field of battle out of nowhere, and then you're sliced to death by a buff vampire with an eye in her palm. That's exactly what happens to every person that goes up against Zorin Blitz. At the beginning of Hellsing Ultimate, Zorin is the strongest vampire that Millennium has by far, and it is due in large part to her illusory powers. Zorin's third eye allowed her to cast illusions and call forth hallucinations that usually paralyzed her victims mentally. She would then proceed to toy with them physically until she'd had her fill of fun, and only give them the mercy of death afterwards. She might not have been a brilliant strategist, as she managed to lose her aerial advantage against Hellsing in a matter of minutes, but she more than made up for it with her own powers. Zorin took out most of Pip Bernadotte's wild geese by herself, torturing her victims mentally and physically as she made her way to their leader. She also very nearly killed Seras Victoria, but instead of treating her as an Alucard level threat like she was supposed to, Zorin decided to enjoy playtime with another actual vampire. Her treatment of Seras just before the latter's awakening is enough to make anyone feel sick to their stomachs, cutting off her left arm and slashing her eyes open, all the while taunting her weakness. And then there's what she does to her mind as well. Zorin makes Seras relive her most traumatic childhood memory, the very reason she became a policewoman in the first place, inadvertently introducing us to the next entry on this list. Needless to say, when Fukin finally has her proper Draculina awakening and she deals with Zorin by literally grinding her face off her body, it feels more cathartic than A-Train's treatment of Blue Hawk and the boys. And that storyline played out over an entire season, while Seras vs. Zorin all took place in a single episode. But speaking of traumatic deaths, Number 6. Seras' parents' killers. Seeing your parents pass away in front of your eyes is going to be disturbing enough to change your life on a fundamental level. I mean, it's Batman's entire origin story, and he's been an iconic comic book character for 4/5 of a century now. But Bruce Wayne should actually be thankful he never went through anything as disturbing as Seras Victoria, because there's no telling if we'd even have a Batman if he experienced what Seras did at the moment of her parents' death. See, the reason that Seras became a police officer was because of her dad. Her dad was a special unit officer just like her, and you might think that she wanted to follow in his footsteps because she was inspired by his life. Instead, it was the trauma that came with his death that made Seras who she is today. Due to an undercover investigation gone wrong, Seras' father suspected that his family was in danger because he was in too deep, and now he was probably going to be silenced for his efforts. His fears weren't unfounded as 2 hitmen arrived in his home and killed both him and his wife. Seras, who was hiding in the closet, ran out and stabbed one of them in the eye. She got hit with a gunshot for her troubles, but before she passed out, she saw the most horrific thing imaginable. The dude she stabbed was violating her mother's corpse. The way the guy comes to the decision of committing necrophilia was just as disturbing as the act itself. Seras got him in the eye and injured him, so he decided to violate her mother's dead body just because. And neither the OVAs nor the manga hold back on documenting this highly disturbing event either. Seras' parents' killers might have only appeared in a single flashback in 10 episodes, but that one appearance from them was enough to let us know that the humans of Hellsing Ultimate were just as irredeemably twisted as their vampiric counterparts. Number 7. The Doctor. You know what's worse than a villain who knows their actions will lead to ultimate destruction? A villain who thinks they are genuinely doing good for the world, and that's exactly what the Doctor thinks as well. A mad scientist commissioned by Millennium to create and outfit the last battalion. If it hadn't been for the Doctor, we wouldn't be talking about Hellsing today. He created every artificial vampire that formed the last standing Nazi army in the world, fashioned werewolves from thin air, probably built all the equipment that Millennium uses, including the Major's body, and also Schrödinger. The Doctor was somehow skilled enough to create a living entity that could be everywhere and nowhere at the same time, as long as it didn't forget its own awareness, thus creating the only thing that could kill Alucard by extension. But where the rest of Millennium was happy to die in the service of beautiful warfare, the Doctor wanted to continue living so that one day his life-saving experiments could change the world itself. Now, imagine a planet Earth populated entirely by immortal ghouls and vampires who were liable to eat each other in times of desperation instead of human beings. Would you want to live in a world like that? Neither would we, and that's why the Doctor is on this list. By himself, he appears to be a harmless, bookish nerd who gets tense at the slightest notion of physical danger, but when you take into consideration the fact that pretty much all of Millennium exists as it does today because of his mad curiosity, then his madness surpasses even that of the man who most certainly inspired his character, Joseph Mengele, the Nazi doctor who was also known as the Angel of Death for his heinous human experimentation programs. Number 8. The Major. If the Doctor is Mengele, then the Major is Hitler himself reborn. Physically, the Major is no threat by himself. He doesn't have an imposing figure and he can't shoot a gun to save his own life. He once missed 8 shots at near point-blank range, and despite being the leader of the last battalion of the Thousand-Year Reich, he is yet to kill anyone by his own hands. And yet, he is the insane mastermind behind all of Millennium's movements throughout Hellsing, both planned and seemingly unplanned. The Major's obsession with war and Alucard leads him to create 1,000 artificial vampires and werewolves, and lead them all to their graves knowing that they didn't stand a chance against the OG Drac himself. When his armies invaded London and lay waste to one of the only strategic locations that Nazi Germany could not capture outright during World War II, the Major was seen conducting a symphony of destruction from atop his Zeppelin aircraft. His sadism is only matched by his devotion to conflict, and the fact that he had Schrödinger created as a foolproof measure against Alucard and his familiars should tell you just how clever his cruelty could be as well. And if you guys still aren't convinced that a guy who can neither shoot a gun nor fight can be as unhinged as we're making the Major out to be here, then go look up his war declaration speech to his minions. It's one of the most epic scenes in Hellsing Ultimate and gives us a crystal clear idea of just what we're dealing with in the Major. A psychopath so obsessed with bloodshed and violence that his paradise is the hellscape that he turns London into. It's an expertly crafted and delivered monologue that not only encapsulates the Major's goals perfectly, it also flat out tells you that this guy is all caps crazy. Number 9. Walter C. Dornez. While the Doctor might be a fictional homage to Joseph Mengele, Walter C. Dornez lives up to his nickname by being Hellsing's Angel of Death. You wouldn't think this innocent Alfred-esque man could chop you into pieces with his Gurrot wires in the blink of an eye, and yet that's Walter's specialty. For a good part of the series, he was one of the good guys, protecting and serving up tea to Integra whilst laying the absolute smackdown on Millennium's vampires, sometimes doing both simultaneously. But as the series came to a conclusion, the Major reveals that he had a final ace up his sleeve, and that ace turned out to be Walter, who had been double-crossing Hellsing since half a century ago. Suddenly, everything he did for Integra, even before she woke Alucard up, started making sense as one elaborate setup. Walter had worked with Alucard during World War II and became convinced that a monster like him should not exist. That, and a bit of coercing from the Major, convinced Walter to join Millennium as a double agent, and he kept that secret from everyone for over 50 years. He was the reason that Integra was forced to reawaken Alucard and protect her from her uncle, who was a known deviant in his own right. Walter programmed Alucard's jackal to explode in his face at a critical moment, and it did, during their final encounter in the streets of London. He did every possible thing he could to defeat Alucard, even becoming an artificial vampire himself, albeit through a flawed process that made him rapidly reverse age the more he used his powers. Walter went from looking like a man in his twilight to the same age that he had first met Alucard at in the matter of a single fight, and it really goes to show you just how far people are willing to go to prove their ideologies correct. In the end, Walter's sacrifices and betrayal amounted to nothing at all, as Alucard defeated him and he was relegated to having to silence the Doctor as a botched attempt at redemption. Walter's betrayal comes out of left field for all of us and makes all of his acts leading up to it seem superficial, which is the real disturbing bit in all of this because of how close he grew to Integra and Seras. His treachery hurt on a personal level, and seeing him lose his mind over not being able to defeat Alucard was genuinely heartbreaking. But speaking of Alucard, Number 10, Alucard. The Count is the protagonist of this series, but make no mistake, Alucard is the worst monster of the whole bunch that gets introduced throughout Kota Hirano's Hellsing. He's been alive for well over 400 years and is dreaded by his own organization just as much as his opponents. Alucard might be the good guy on paper, but his reckless attitude towards human casualties isn't something that only got to Walter. Every time we see Alucard in action, we end up questioning why we're cheering this guy on because more often than not, he's more brutal with his enemies than Millennium or even Iscariot. His attack on Rip Van Winkle is one of the most disconcerting Alucard kills of the entire series, and the way he keeps upping the ante of violence with every passing episode speaks for itself. Alucard possesses the power to store every soul he has drank in his lifetime as familiars within himself, and when he releases his control art restrictions, things tend to get even more unhinged than his usual trigger-happy routine. And towards the end of Hellsing, he turns London into a garden of spears flowered by the corpses of his enemies as he returns to his master triumphantly. Alucard's sheer swagger and force of personality are what keep him in our list of good people, because honestly, if he was even slightly less empathetic than he was made out to be, we don't know if Hellsing would have become the cult icon it is today. Marvelous verdict. But as for this video, that's gonna have to be it. Hellsing Ultimate is one of the most visceral and grotesque anime series of all time, and these characters play a major role in making it so. Without them, the story could have been something more like the first Hellsing anime, a toned-down Hellboy ripoff that only sticks to operating as a department for paranormal activities and lets loose its ultimate counterpart only on occasion. Thankfully, we got the OVAs, which allow us to enjoy Hirano's bloody masterpiece in all of its gory glory. But which character do you think is the worst out of everyone on this list? Or do you think that title belongs to someone else entirely? Let us know in the comments section down below, and we'll see you guys in the next one.